Right, thank you and welcome back to our second presentation of this evening. Our second speaker is Alexandra Sills, who is also a returning speaker to this conference. Alexandra is a postgraduate student at the University of Leicester. Her research interests are Roman spectacle and its reception, ancient and modern. Her paper today is entitled Greek Gladiators, Adoption and Adaptation of Roman Spectacle in the East. And I hand over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now to share my screen. Okay. So I will be talking, as said, about gladiators in the East. I'm going to have to apologise to Eduardo because I'm going to be talking about the East as a monolith. I can only apologise. This is early stage of research and I need to look at the whole before I break it down to its component parts, so forgive me. So if we talk about gladiatorial combat, we think of it as very stereotypically Roman. And if we look at this map here of the empire, each red dot represents an amphitheatre. And you can see that there are hundreds of them. And again, it's a very stereotypically form of entertainment that's very Roman. Same goes for the building. If we look at the eastern end of the empire, it's a slightly different story. So Greece, Turkey and Cyprus have fewer amphitheatres than the UK between them. Most of these amphitheatres are later. 2nd century is a real boom for amphitheatres in the East. Apart from before that, we've really only got two in Corinth and in Antioch. This has been taken to mean that the Greeks didn't have particular interest in Roman spectacle, weren't interested in adopting it at all, and that it was a form of Romanisation which failed miserably. Not quite the truth. So what's happening between the two early amphitheatres in the 40s BCE and those large amphitheatres in Asia Minor several centuries later? It's true that the Greeks didn't build a lot of amphitheatres because they were too busy putting on shows in existing buildings or adapting the buildings that they had, or building monuments that were already multi-purpose, where different kinds of spectacles could be performed. There are very many different types, and these are the types that I'm going to be talking about today. So you can see they're all slightly different. They all have their own different details. But for a venue to be able to have spectacle performed, all you really need is some form of protection between the spectators and the performers in the arena. So how do you perform gladiatorial combat if you don't have an amphitheatre? The initial option would be the circus. This is what we know happened in Rome before amphitheatres were built there. The Circus Maximus was quite often used for spectacle, both for beast hunts and gladiatorial combat before amphitheatres were built. We can see here some circuses in the East, and the reason that they're so perfect is because you don't have to do anything to a circus to be able to set gladiatorial combat here. You've already got a curved end at the end of the racetrack, which is perfect for viewers to be able to see from all angles. And you've also got a crucial podium wall, meaning that the first rows of seatings are a lot higher than the racetrack itself. For the circus, this was obviously to protect the audience from the crashes of the chariots, the shipwrecks, but it's also perfect to protect their feet from sharp weapons as well. We've also got stadiums. In the classical Greek period onwards, the stadiums are quite plain rectangles with maybe a grassy bank, to seat the spectators. Stone seating was a bit of a Roman thing, and in the stadiums that we see, particularly here, the stone seating that was installed has that podium wall separating the racetrack from the arena. And we've also got hypostadia. So they're slightly larger than stadia just for running events, but they're smaller than circuses. So they can have equine races just without the chariots. And here we see them mapped out here. Also, again, these have the crucial podium wall, as we can see here. In Magnesia, recently excavated, you can see that podium wall. It's about 1.5 meters high, which is perfectly adequate. and it goes the entire length as far as we can tell. We know that this stadium was used for gladiatorial combat because excavators found several reliefs of gladiators as part of its decoration. We've also got amphitheatre, amphistadia all around. So you've got two curved ends of the stadium. The seating goes all around. And we can see this one here at Aphrodisias, shown on Google Earth. Again, it has the crucial podium wall, but you can also here see it's marked out at one end. At some point later on in this monument's life, the end of the racetrack was walled off to create an amphitheatre space. The rest of the running track was shortened, and this is perhaps a sign that in the later Roman period, athletic events were slightly less interesting than gladiators, and it was chosen to be less multifunctional. This is a very permanent change. So when we look at all of these sports venues, we can see that actually gladiatorial combat has a far wider spread than perhaps previously assumed. And we do have gladiators comparing themselves to Greek athletes. There's one who describes himself on his tomb as a boxer, even though he's dressed as a murmillo. But it isn't just athletics that the Greeks are enjoying about the games. They also enjoy the drama of the games, and where better to produce a drama than a theatre. Here we see the theatre at Argos marked out. You can see post holes in between the orchestra and the seating, about 1.5 meters apart on average in these theatres, and these were for temporary barriers and fences. So you can dig a few holes, erect your fence in minutes, and take it down after the gladiatorial combat has finished, and your theatre is ready to revert back in preparation for dramatic performances. And theatres that have taken this rather makeshift approach are mentioned here. It's a quick and easy solution that's fairly cheap, and most of all, it's temporary. That seems to be important. I mean, I think we can assume, even though post hole is difficult to date, this is quite an early solution for cities wanting to present gladiatorial spectacle. Slightly more permanent, and here we see Athens, is a parapet wall. This one is about 1 meter high, completely blocking out the orchestra from the seating. And this replaces the barrier. It's in the same place as the barrier, only much more permanent. And again, it protects the audience from the performers and, in some cases, animals. Why the switch to permanence? Perhaps we can take from this that shows we're becoming a little bit more violent, a little larger. But the most prominent change is that it can't be removed, and it's very, very visible. This is a permanent change and a very visual acceptance of its new multifunctional purpose. Over in other theatres, such as this one at Dodona, the change was made to, like in the stadia, raise the front rows higher than the orchestra level. And if we look here, if we follow this line of seating down, we can see that in Dodona, 4 rows of seating were removed. You can see here where the seating originally would have finished. And this renders the space safe for the front rows of spectators. I think the largest of these adaptations was at Corinth in the Grand Theatre, where 10 rows of seats were removed, meaning that the orchestra was not only widened, but significantly lower than the spectators. And you can see those mapped here. Some of these theatres already had the temporary barriers before they decided on permanent changes. And there are some cities where there's multiple of these adaptations. For instance, in Stoby, you've got a podium wall with a parapet wall on top of that, with post holes for temporary barriers on top of that as well. So that means that we have a dense spread of theatres. Now, there are obviously hundreds of theatres across the Greek world, and about 5% seem to show some kind of change. That's a tiny amount considering how many theatres there are. But when we look at the map, you can see that the spread is still quite dense. Other cities really got into the gladiatorial games, and they chose to have multiple venues. So these cities either had an amphitheatre with a theatre or stadium, or in any combination, which is demonstrating that gladiatorial combat was not only shown in diverse locations, but even within a city, we want a diverse set of options for gladiatorial combat, depending on the type of show. We also have a huge spread of cities and towns where there's epigraphic evidence for gladiatorial combat, but with no discernible venue. Some cases, this is because the theatres and the stadiums haven't been excavated enough to give any answer about whether there were adaptations. Sometimes there is no suitable sports or dramatic venue, but we do have several gravestones. We also have a lot of honorary dedications from imperial cult priests saying that they have provided or will provide shows, and these are mapped out for you here. So, what do you need to put on a show if you don't have a venue? Not a lot, really. You just need a large flat space where you can put benches in a bleacher style seating. The agora is perfect for this, maybe a gymnasium. With spaces that have buildings around them, you can also wooden buildings to the wooden balconies, to the buildings around, meaning that you've got 2 layers of seating. Or you can have a smaller space as long as you've got some kind of slope next to it for spectators to stand on. So as long as you've got carpenters and wood, you don't actually need to do a lot to present gladiatorial spectacle at all. And this is the same as in Rome. The very first fights in Rome were in the Forum, before they moved into the Circus Maximus and before the purpose-built amphitheatres were designed. So I think it's right to assume, given the spread of epigraphic evidence, that we should consider these makeshift buildings being built right across Asia Minor and Greece. So if you look at the timeline of the development of gladiatorial combat up until the imperial period, you can see that in the East, they actually take it on fairly early. Antiochus IV presented gladiators at Daphne as part of a huge show that included chariots and other types of fighters, dramatic performances, music, dances. He'd been a hostage at Rome, and he was essentially coming home and saying, "Look, this is what I've learned. This is what I've seen." The interesting thing is that Antiochus has apparently already been showing gladiators in Antioch, but he'd been complaining that the ones that he'd been importing from Rome were too expensive. So at this show, he specifies that they are actually all of Greek origin and trained by him rather than rented out. Looking at the timeline, we can also see the timeline of amphitheatres. The first permanent amphitheatre that we know of in the West is at Pompeii, 70 BCE. It's Caesar that's building the first ones in the East, at Antioch and at Corinth, only 30 years after the first stone amphitheatre in Pompeii. Republican amphitheatres are almost exclusively, apart from Caesar's ones, restricted to the Italian peninsula. That's really how it stays until the 1st century CE. They start spreading to France and Spain. They don't to Greece and Asia Minor for a little while longer. But in the early days, it's fairly even. And we can see that it's not just Julius Caesar performing, putting on shows either. His peers are also providing these shows. It's not just him. They're providing shows for their veterans, for their soldiers, and for colonists, not necessarily for the Greek locals. That's something that we notice is the Greek audiences take on an enthusiasm for gladiatorial combat far more than some of the other areas. So when we look at the map, we can see that actually this area is got a pretty dense spread of gladiatorial activity, and in a myriad of different venues and types. Then when we look at the empire at large, all of a sudden, the old idea that the Greeks refused to adopt gladiatorial combat and that it was a gangrene that had infected the Greek world, as one scholar in the 1940s put it, you can now see that particularly Turkey has just as many venues as the Italian peninsula, and Tunisia maybe only third to those two. And then when we add our attested venues, we really see how popular gladiatorial combat should be in this area. We just don't have, at the moment, a collection of all of this evidence all compiled into one place. One thing that I think is really interesting about gladiatorial combat in the East is that it looks the same. If you're coming from a show in the Colosseum in Rome into Asia Minor or Greece, the show itself will, as far as you know, look pretty much the same. The armor is the same. The rules, as far as we can make them out, are the same. The difference is how these gladiators are discussed, how they discuss themselves, and how they name themselves. Here we see a collection of attested gladiatorial stage names. In the West, stage names are short, snappy, staccato, usually one or two consonants, things like flamma or flame. But here we can see in the East, they are cherry-picking their names from epic poetry, from drama. When you think about the Greek area as it's got a deeply embedded culture that they're very proud of, and Rome is certainly in awe of the culture of the Greek world. There seems to be a conscious effort to emphasize that and to retain it. And when you think about these people have been growing up on a diet of Homeric epic and all of the tragedies, you've heard of these fights, these epic one-on-one fights and duels. And now you can go and see them live, performed by people fighting under the stage names of the heroes that you've grown up with. Another difference in the East is funerary decoration, in the fact that they have some funerary decoration. In the West, you're likely to get blank stones with maybe a name, a fighter type, the amount of victories if you're lucky. In the East, they're really emphasizing art, and they're putting themselves in their own little section in this way. We have two types here, the victorious gladiator standing face on, or the gladiator in battle shown in profile. And we also have the funerary banquet scene, which we do not see in the West. So this one looks fairly ordinary, apart from, you will notice the wreaths that mark out how many combats this particular man won. And in the bottom corner, you'll see his helmet and shield have been incised into the stone. So the funerary banquet scenes are all fairly standard, except for the fact that they all prominently display their gladiatorial weaponry. When you think of the infamia that was imposed on gladiators in the West, they may not like to advertise their gladiatorial low status as much, but in the East, they really want to emphasize it as much as possible. Something else is the deep connection to Greek religion. In a lot of the stones in the epitaphs of these men, they are mentioning their fatalistic tendencies with mentions of the Moirai. And this is across Greece and Asia Minor. The Moirai are frequently mentioned and never given, rarely given blame as such. Quite often, fights have gone one way or another. Blame is never attributed, should I say, to their opponents, occasionally to opponents or cheating referees, but most of the time the opponent is innocent because all of this has been pre-written. So that's a distinct difference that we see between the East and the West. Another difference is you don't see references to Nemesis, who is of course a Greek goddess who has been adopted by gladiators in the West. You'll find sanctuaries and chapels to her in Western amphitheatres. You will find altars dedicated to her, votives dedicated to Nemesis. Greek gladiators ignore her completely. Whenever she's mentioned in the East, it is by the imperial cult priests who are putting on these shows. The gladiators are ignoring her completely, save for one altar dedication in Halicarnassus. The gladiators also like to situate themselves in the Greek culture by talking very much in terms of myth. They will compare themselves not only to mythic heroes in terms of their military might, but in their beauty. For instance, particularly Retiarius, the net fighter, you will frequently see them comparing themselves to beautiful men of myth, because they are the only ones that fight without helmets, so they're quite often seen as the heartthrobs of the gladiatorial world. They compare themselves to heroes frequently, as I say, with, for instance, Heracles. You may say that Heracles completed 12 labours. Well, so did I. That particular epitaph occurs at least twice. And there are frequent discussions about going down into Hades and what that might entail, including a loss of daylight, a loss of warmth, and a loss of freedom. When we think about what gladiatorial combat is, it's a celebration in the West of masculinity and manly virtues, yes, but also Roman ideology. In the East, they're enthusiastically talking about masculine virtues, not so much the ideology and the inherent imperialism. But when we look at Greek culture and its obsession with competition, combat sports, combat in myth and epic poetry, and the appreciation for a well-muscled body, when you put all of those together, you can absolutely see why a Greek would look at Roman gladiatorial combat and see something that they inherently enjoy. This is something that combines many passions in the Greek world, and they're performing it in Greek spaces. They're performing it with Greek stage names. They're performing it in concert with existing Greek performance types. So this isn't, I don't think, a form of Romanization. This is an enthusiastic adoption of Roman spectacle and turning it into something that matches and complements their existing Greek set of entertainments. So in summary, the Greek world was not infected, as a gangrene might, with gladiatorial combat. In fact, we do have one instance from Aphrodisias where the imperial cult priests are asking the Emperor Hadrian, what should we do? We know we need to provide something as part of our role. Should we build an aqueduct, or should we put on a gladiatorial show, because they are fun? And the Emperor Hadrian is having to say, are you stupid? You need to build an aqueduct. This is far more useful to your citizens. Build the aqueduct, the gladiators can come later. What we don't see is the Romans pushing any kind of spectacle onto the Greeks. They're not forcing the locals to attend or participate. It seems to be entirely voluntary, something that was introduced to give Roman colonists a feel of home, has been kind of appropriated by the locals. I think there's definitely more evidence that's going to be coming through. Several of the theatres that have recently been excavated have shown adaptation, and we're getting new epigraphy all the time. Apart from that, the future remains to be seen how much we can find. I'm confident that we'll be finding a lot more. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Alexandra.